We're here today to speak with one of the contributors to our new book, How to Heal Our Divides. K Scarry serves as community director of the People's Supper. She has always been enamored with the life that can be shared around the table and the ways those spaces invite us to be fully human together. Driven by a conviction that people should have consistent space where they are welcomed in, Kay launched an open community meal in her hometown a few years ago that continues today. Before joining the People's Supper team, she worked in a number of nonprofit organizations exploring different manifestations of community, with women coming out of sex trafficking, in a fraternity house, as an associate pastor, and as a chaplain in a maximum security women's prison. She's currently finishing up her Master's of Divinity at Wesley Theological Seminary. So Kay, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It is good to be here. It's really good to be here.
Well, I'm really glad that you're contributing to this book and telling the world about the People's Supper because, it's just the right kind of effort that I think is perfect for people to get involved in. So, but before we get to that, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your background beyond what I briefly shared.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. I grew up in a family that came from a little bit of different worlds. My dad was the son of an NFL player and coach, and my mom, the daughter of a missionary to West Africa. And so they grew up in totally different worlds. And I remember as when we were kids that so much of what they instilled in us was that all of the places you find yourself are an invitation to take really good care of the people you're around. And I remember that our home was always open to all kinds of people. I remember that I belonged to a church growing up with folks from all different countries. And so all of our holidays were full of people from all around the world. And I just remember my parents really instilling in me the question of the deeper story. So when you encounter folks who are acting a particular way, that the invitation is to try and understand a deeper story of what might be happening in their world. And I felt that instilled in me such a curiosity about people and their story and experience and all the things that might propel us to show up in the world in the ways that we do. And so, yeah, as you kind of mentioned, I, after college, worked in a number of different spaces, but all really propelled by that question of what is it that leads to community formation? What is it that makes people who they are? How might we get a little deeper into the experiences of one another so that we might create communities that work for all of us? And that's a question that has really driven me.
Well, one of the common threads between all of those different works and what you're doing right now is, obviously you're trying to help people,
Yeah.
Kind of at the grassroots level, which is really, a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting. I think so much of that is accompanied by the reckoning with my own story. What does it mean to hold the complexities of my own experience? And I think that those are spaces that I'm doing that alongside different people. I think those things go really deeply hand in hand. That what does it mean to kind of hold myself as minister, student, daughter, friend, as a person who, I think as a person who has experienced trauma and as a person who believes in healing, like all of those, I think as a person who's experienced loss and as a person who really wants to believe better for our communities, I think learning to hold all of those things as true about me is a practice that is also a driving force for me, and being able to sit, I don't know how to do that unless I'm doing it alongside other people.
Very cool. So the People's Supper, how did that get started?
Yeah. Yeah. So after the 2016 presidential election, I sensed in my own self, though I wasn't part of the founding team of the People's Supper, I sensed as alongside a lot of people in our country, the question of how did we get here? And how did we become so polarized? I think across the country, we were feeling the acute pain of polarization and the question of where do we go from here and how do we start talking to one another? And so a group of friends who all ran their own organizations, so Lennon Flowers of the Dinner Party, Emily May of Hollaback, and Jen Bailey of Faith Matters Network started connecting and thinking, we're not going to argue our way out of this. And so how might we invite people to gather across lines of difference to really repair the breach in our interpersonal relationships? And so initially the People's Supper was intended to be a 100-day campaign. So the idea was that in the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, there would be 100 suppers all over the country in individuals' homes. We would have trained them to learn how to facilitate, how to ask good questions, how to invite people, how to really set up diverse spaces for deep story sharing so that we might understand the stories that often propel us to show up in the world in the ways we do, but maybe aren't the stories that we're apt to share so quickly. So I always tell people that if our being here is any spoiler, that after 100 days, we realized our work wasn't done. And I joined the team about a year after the People's Supper started. And our work has shifted pretty significantly, where we started with really addressing, or we started in response to, I should say, political polarization. And we started with teaching people how to power these gatherings in their own homes. We've shifted now, realize as culture has shifted, where political polarization in the abstract isn't enough to propel people to gather, but kind of the X factor of like an acute pain point felt in our particular community will propel people to gather. And so we work now much more alongside community partners and organizations who have a bit of a staying power, and we accompany them in the work of repair. And we really center our work on the question of what is it that needs healing here.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, talk about some of the different locations and activities and, some of the logistics of how, the People Supper operates today.
Yeah, thank you. So I often tell people that I'll say that we would bring the expertise on how you do this stuff. And basically that's come from powering hundreds of these all over the country over the last 4 years. But we really honor that our partners bring the expertise on their community. And one of our biggest learnings is that there's some broad strokes stories of what does and doesn't work, but figuring out how to fit that into the real particular facets of each specific community is part of what we are able to do alongside partners. So some of the places we're working right now, we're working on a racial justice series with the Baltimore Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church. We've been doing a number of racial justice series. So one of them is we've worked alongside the Eerie, Pennsylvania Mayor's Office. The question of what needs healing here, we've worked alongside educators in LA around the question of how do we move from competition to collaboration. We've worked with a group of clergy in Northern Virginia, of interfaith clergy in Northern Virginia around racial justice as well. And then also we're working on a series right now in Brooklyn, New York with the Brooklyn Borough President's Office as they're kind of reckoning with over the last year, the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and anti-Semitic hate crimes. They're really, and with kind of the Black Lives Matter movement kind of raising on folks' collective consciousness, they're working on a series of gatherings to invite folks across Brooklyn to choose to see and hear and connect with one another instead of continue to kind of retreat into our own silos.
Very cool. So within your chapter of our book, you talk in a lot of detail about Eerie, Pennsylvania, which is, interesting case study. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
I would love to. So I feel like Eerie is very near and dear to my heart. That's a project that I have led on and deeply worked alongside the Eerie Mayor's Office staff, who is beloved to me for the last 2.5 years. And in 2017, a USA Today article named Eerie as the worst place in the country for African Americans to live. And USA Today publishes that study every year. And speaking of that X factor of the thing that kind of makes your community realize we probably should be gathering, that was it for them, as it should be. I mean, that statistic is fairly jarring. And so what stunned me about the response was the mayor of Eerie, Joe Schember, called us in and instead of jumping to action and solution and deliverables, he said his humility and approach and invitation for us to kind of help him think about the need for repair and his intuition around it's not just solution, it's relationship building that needs to happen in this moment here was pretty stunning to me. And part of what I mentioned in the chapter is it felt like to me our first moment of being able to solve the real link between relationship building and policy change, because that's also necessary too. So we worked with them to devise a plan where we gathered 80 participants across Eerie who represented the story of the Eerie community. We had 20 African Americans, 20 white participants, 20 new Americans, so folks who had just become citizens who were from all different countries, and then 20 Latinx participants. And they gathered for a series of 5 suppers. Well, there were 7 suppers in the series, but everyone was part of 5, every individual. We use what we both bridging suppers, which is gathering everyone and connecting folks across lines of difference, and then affinity gatherings, which is where we moved people into their particular identity groups to be able to unpack their experiences from those particular identities in a way that was safe and that also led towards harm reduction a little bit. But one of the most stunning things about the series to me is the mayor offered that those participants could come up with ways to make Eerie more equitable based on the stories they had heard after building trust with one another across multiple gatherings. And the mayor said that he would take on whatever they came up with, and the mayor wasn't part of those series. So that kind of willingness to lay down some power a little bit, he and his staff also went through the questions themselves, but they weren't sitting in on any of those discussions amongst the participants to try and sway them in any way. And so that was kind of our big, like I mentioned, a learning in what does it mean to take relationship building and trust and translate it into a different way forward for our communities? How do we change whose perspective is welcome in the conversation? How do we, part of what we did there was really challenge the participants to be asking the same questions out in the community and to bring to bear on the series voices from others that they would encounter that couldn't necessarily be part of the series. And then since then, I think it's pretty astonishing. After we went through those gatherings, we left the series with 10 ideas that the participants had come up with to make Eerie more equitable. Then we invited 300 members of the Eerie community to hear those and make commitments to see them happen. And then since, we've worked alongside the Eerie Mayor's office staff around what it means to implement those ideas and kind of the accountability piece. And some of what my boss, Lennon Flowers, would say is that our role became to kind of sweat the small stuff and continue to call them back to the work of building trust alongside each other as they were doing the implementation, when so many things might threaten the process or the work that they had set out to do on the front end.
Well, it's very cool that you stuck with that, over a period of time. That's, I think, a key component to all of this. It's not a one-shot deal.
Right. It's absolutely a long game. And I stamina for the long game and the willingness to keep believing in it, even on the days you don't believe in it, I think is so, that was so much my experience. And it is Eerie, I mentioned they're so beloved to me. It was the most wonderful body of work, and it was complicated. It was really being in the weeds with a group of people and continuing to believe that we could build a future for Eerie together that worked for everyone, even when every other thing seemed to threaten that process.
So more generally speaking, if either communities want to get involved with the People Supping or individuals, what are the paths that they can take?
Yeah, so we kind of have 3 bodies of work that people can fall into right now. So those racial justice series are intended for already established multiracial communities to go through a journey together over time. It's intentionally a space for us to say out loud some things that we need to be able to work through and to call people to do some reckoning and to see their community more fully. And it's intended to move folks into action steps they might complete together. So that's one. The other is that kind of broader what needs healing here. So if it's some places it is political polarization, some places it's we don't know how to work out our religious difference. And so that's another kind of bucket of our work. And then the third is a third bucket of our work right now that's come out of the coronavirus is what we're calling seeing each other through or seeing communities through. And that's really a space where we're helping communities kind of rally to show up for one another and combating isolation and supporting local business and helping neighbors in need, mostly out of in the moment where we are completely isolated, how do we how do we continue to strengthen community ties that then allow us to address some of those bigger inequities or bigger kind of moments of rupture. So those are our three bucket areas. All of our resources are available online. We know that we don't want to be a stopgap for communities needing to have to work with us to be able to see this stuff, to use some of our lessons. So we have a number of guidebooks online, and are working now on a recorded training online that folks can just access and use. If people want us to do a deeper dive alongside them and kind of do that deep accompaniment like we did in a place like Eerie, they can reach out to us over email on a form on our website, and we can kind of work out, we tailor partnerships with all different community organizations to see which, like, to make sure that we're meeting their particular needs.
Well, one of the things I love the way that you guys have shifted, your focus as the needs identified themselves. That's a wonderful trait of entrepreneurship in general. And, clearly, you guys have been nimble and been able to react to the needs that you see.
Yeah, I'm laughing because Lennon and I were talking about this yesterday. It's a gift and it's complicated. I think it matters to us. We've gotten really, really clear on the deeper, this is what we're trying to do, and the mechanism by which we might do it is going to shift as culture shifts, as the needs of communities shifts. And that is wonderful. I mean, it is the ability to kind of maintain the ability to maintain the integrity of our work requires a willingness to adjust accordingly as our culture adjusts, as communities we're working with adjust, and as it's on a micro level as well as on a macro level. So organizationally, we've shifted, but even in each of our series, we design for feedbacking along the way to understand what this particular community might need additional support on. And I really am proud of that in our work, and it is complicated. I mean, if we're talking to folks who are doing this work in their own communities, I'm sure the kind of wrestling with and continuing to examine the work you're doing and continuing to invite people to that deeper, this is what we're trying to do. This healing work is what we're trying to do, when the mechanism might change, and the willingness to be able to shift and adjust is a necessary part of it. And like I said, I'm proudest of that in our work, even as I hold it with all of its complexity.
Well, you're in territory that is naturally difficult, right? And
Yeah.
complex, right? So it's not surprising that, it's just the answers are not inherently obvious, right? I mean, you have to work through a lot of tough things that have gives and pulls and, conflicting needs. And so,
Yeah, and it's
good for you for recognizing that and working through that.
yeah, thank you. Well, it's also, and it's personal, like the folks who show up to this work are so deeply invested in their community. They're so long, and often folks are coming from a real point of pain or grief. And I think that our sister project is the dinner party, which connects folks in their 20s and 30s who've experienced a significant loss. And oftentimes people struggle to see the through line, but bridging work is so deeply the work of grief, of tending to the grief, of rupture, of pain, of not being seen, and inviting folks to really hold one another with incredible care, and to find our common humanity. I think something that's important to us is we've really shifted from, we're not really seeking to find common ground as much as common humanity, and to complicate the narratives of who people are, when it's all too easy to see someone's landing place, their perspective or their identities, and assume stories of their origin, or stories of all the things they might hold or carry. I think we're really setting a table for the opportunity for people to be complicated and to hold kind of a deeper story of who people are. But we're also tending to people's grief. We are, even if it's not articulated as such, we are sitting with folks um, in places of rupture and pain and loss, and it's personal. This is my professional work as much as it is my own ways of being in the world, and the ways I long to show up in my neighborhood when I clock out at the end of the day. And um, that by its very nature means that you've got to be able to hold the integrity of the work and be nimble, but it's no small feat.
Well, Kay, thank you so much for all the great work that you've done and for being part of this project. It's important to, shine a spotlight on, organizations like yours and the work that you're doing. And I really want to spread that word and let people become more aware of how you can help deal with some of these and look to be intractable
Yeah,
problems.
well, thank you, Brian. And for all the folks who tune in asking these questions too, I think it's important to me that we ask them alongside you, and I think this work takes all of us. And so I'm always encouraged and energized by other people who are thinking about this and committed to this, and who are longing to do this type of work in their own communities as well. So I'm glad to do it too.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for contributing to this and for joining us on this
Yeah, thank
program.
you. It's good to be here.